The moon is a graveyard of dreams and silver dust, a place where time has effectively stood still since December 1972. In the quiet desolation of the Taurus-Littrow Valley, a single, solitary footprint remains etched into the lunar soil. It belongs to Gene Cernan, the commander of Apollo 17, and for over 50 years, it has served as a silent fossil of human ambition. When Cernan climbed back into the lunar module for the final time, he spoke of returning with peace and hope for all mankind. He did not know that his would be the last human mark left on that world for more than half a century. That footprint, once a symbol of a giant leap, slowly transformed into a haunting monument of a promise broken by humanity, a testament to a species that had reached the heavens only to turn its back on them. In the decades that followed, NASA itself underwent a profound and painful transformation. To understand the current era, one must see NASA not as a cold government agency, but as a personified veteran explorer. This was a pioneer who had once conquered the impossible, a giant who had mapped the lunar plains and stood where no one else dared. But after the triumph of the Apollo era, this veteran was effectively grounded. He was brought home, stripped of his wide-open horizons, and forced into the narrow corridors of bureaucracy. Shifting political winds and fluctuating budgets became his new gravity, pulling him down until his eyes were no longer fixed on the stars, but on the floor of a committee room. He didn't lose his brilliance, but he lost his permission to be daring. For 50 long years, the motivation for spaceflight shifted from the raw spirit of discovery to the calculated necessity of survival. During the Space Shuttle era and the construction of the International Space Station, NASA focused on mastering low Earth orbit. These were noble, essential goals that built the foundation for long-term habitation, yet they lacked the visceral, heart-pounding energy of the moonshot. We stayed in our own backyard, perfecting the art of orbiting our own planet, while the deep black of the lunar horizon grew distant and hazy. This period became known as the Lost Decades, a time when infrastructure began to crumble, and the literal blueprints for the Saturn V rockets were archived in dusty basements. The collective memory of how to reach the moon, once shared by thousands of engineers, began to fade like an old photograph left too long in the sun. As the veteran explorer sat in the shadows of his past achievements, the world around him began to change. A new tension started to build as fresh players entered the cosmic stage. The rise of new space, driven by aggressive private companies and international rivals, began to challenge the old guard. These newcomers eyed the lunar South Pole with a hunger that NASA hadn't felt in decades. They didn't just want to visit. They wanted the resources and the glory that came with them. This looming competition threatened the legacy of the old explorer, forcing a realization that if he did not return soon, the footprints he left behind would be replaced by the tracks of those who moved faster and with less hesitation. The emotional weight of this hiatus was most visible in the eyes of the aging Apollo engineers. These veterans, many now in the twilight of their lives, lived with the quiet heartbreak of seeing their life's greatest work remain untouched for 50 years. They watched as the rockets they built were turned into museum exhibits rather than vehicles of progress. However, out of this long winter of neglect, the Artemis program was finally born. It was announced not as a repeat of the past, but as a permanent return. This was NASA's chance at redemption, a mission to not just visit the moon, but to stay. The stakes were absolute. If Artemis failed now, the dream of human lunar exploration would likely die forever with the generation that first conceived it. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Just as the fire of ambition was finally reignited, a massive shadow fell over the program. During the early, critical testing of the space launch system, the gargantuan rocket intended to carry the Artemis missions, a series of devastating technical hurdles emerged. Valves failed, software glitched, and the very foundation of the SLS was called into question by a skeptical public. The veteran explorer was standing at the edge of the launch pad, staring at a machine that seemed to groan under the weight of its own complexity, wondering if the recipe for the moon had truly been lost to the sands of time. The Space Launch System, or SLS, stood on the launch pad like a towering monument to both human ingenuity and the stubborn weight of history. It was a monster of a rocket, more powerful than any other, that held the title of the most powerful launch vehicle ever assembled. Yet, its physical size was dwarfed by its symbolic burden. For NASA, the SLS was too expensive to fail. Every bolt and software line had been scrutinized under the glare of political oversight. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was the old explorer's final gamble to reclaim his legacy. In the shadow of this orange giant stood 4 individuals who had accepted a responsibility that bordered on the mythic. Reed Wiseman, the commander with the steady eyes of a veteran. Victor Glover, the pilot whose every smile hid the gravity of his mission. Christina Koch, an expert explorer, and Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian specialist who carried the pride of an entire nation. Together, they were the human face of Artemis II. They weren't just flying for NASA, they were carrying the hopes and the visceral fears of 8 billion people. Their personal motivation wasn't found in glory, but in the realization that they were the thin line between a new era of exploration and a broken promise. At the tip of the monster rocket sat the Orion capsule, the vessel intended to be their sanctuary. Orion was designed to be the ultimate character of safety, a mechanical fortress meant to shield them from the searing heat and invisible arrows of radiation. However, the path to the stars was paved with technical nightmares. The ordeal of Orion became a series of dramatic hurdles that tested the resolve of every engineer. There were anomalies in the heat shield's integrity during tests and life support glitches that suggested the capsule's internal environment might become a tomb rather than a home. These were more than just simple engineering challenges. They were chilling reminders that the deep dark does not forgive a single mistake. The ghostly specter of Apollo 1 haunted the Kennedy Space Center. The memory of the 3 astronauts lost in a cabin fire decades ago served as a warning. The tension reached a fever pitch as the crew and the public alike realized the true nature of Artemis II. This wasn't a landing mission. It was a terrifying test drive, a high-speed loop around the lunar far side that would hurl these 4 brave souls further into the abyss than any human had ever ventured. They would be alone in the silent deep space, orbiting a world they could see with their own eyes but were forbidden to touch. This internal pressure was further complicated by a culture of conflict within the space industry itself. A high-stakes battle was being fought between the traditional, old space methods of NASA and the aggressive, fail-fast mentality of new space rivals like SpaceX. The veteran explorer felt the immense pressure to move with the speed of a private startup while maintaining the rigorous safety standards of a government agency. This created a highly pressurized environment where every delay was seen as a sign of weakness, and every decision was a calculated and dangerous risk between progress and catastrophe. As the years of delays stretched on, the public began to voice a painful question. Did we lose the recipe for the moon? The collective memory of the 1960s successes felt increasingly like a fading legend. Yet, a moment of triumph finally arrived with the success of Artemis II. The uncrewed mission was a beacon of hope that suggested the veteran explorer was finally ready to reclaim his crown. But the celebration was short-lived. Upon the capsule's return, engineers discovered that the Orion heat shield had charred in a way they never expected. The material had eroded and melted away in a strange, unpredictable pattern during its fiery descent. This shocking discovery cast a shadow of absolute uncertainty over the lives of the Artemis II crew, leaving the mission's future hanging by a single, thin, frayed thread. The discovery of the charred heat shield left the veteran explorer at a crossroads. NASA's leadership faced a moral dilemma that would have paralyzed a lesser organization. On one hand, delaying the mission to redesign the thermal protection system could mean losing the vital political momentum and funding that had taken decades to secure. On the other hand, moving forward with a known anomaly meant risking the lives of the 4 heroes who had become the symbols of humanity's return. This was not just about hardware. It was about the soul of an agency that had defined human ambition for generations. It was a choice between the survival of the program and the survival of its pioneers. Every engineer knew that a failure here wouldn't just be a tragedy, it would be the final nail in the coffin for human deep space exploration. Away from the technical debates, the human core of the mission beat with a fragile rhythm. The families of Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen lived in a state of suspended animation. They understood the stakes better than anyone. For the first time in half a century, parents were preparing to leave the protective embrace of Earth, venturing into a radiation-soaked abyss where no rescue could ever reach them. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it for the sake of a better future. Their sacrifice was the silent fuel of the Artemis program. In the quiet moments before sleep, these families contemplated the terrifying beauty of the moon, knowing their loved ones would be the most isolated humans in history. This personal connection transformed the mission into a deeply human story of courage and love. The response to the heat shield crisis was not one of surrender, but of grueling preparation. Engineers analyzed every charred millimeter of the material, using supercomputers to simulate the violent re-entry at speeds of 25,000 miles per hour. Software was rewritten to provide the crew with manual control over the Orion's descent. The 4 astronauts lived in simulators, practicing the critical translunar injection, the moment when the rocket would hurl them toward the lunar far side. They rehearsed every failure and every possible catastrophe until their movements were instinctual and their resolve was unshakable. As preparations reached a crescendo, the purpose of the mission shifted. This was no longer just a remake of the Cold War race. The competition with private entities remained, but it was being eclipsed by a sense of global cooperation. The mission was about humanity's collective return to the stars, a realization that the moon was not the final destination, but the essential bridge to the red deserts of Mars. Without the success of Artemis II, the path to the rest of the solar system would remain blocked by the fear that had grounded the explorer for 50 years. The veteran explorer looked back at the grainy images of the Apollo 17 footprint, still sitting undisturbed in the lunar dust. He could see the digital render of the future. The Artemis II crew, framed by the windows of the Orion capsule, looking down at the rugged landscape of the lunar far side. They would see what Gene Cernan saw, but with the knowledge that a permanent home, the lunar gateway, was soon to follow. This was the redemption of a promise made in 1972. Today, the status of the mission is one of focused resolve. The countdown has begun. The fear of the unknown remains. But the collective will of NASA is stronger now than it was during the 1960s. We have the technology, the crew, and the reason. The engines are being prepped, and the eyes of 8 billion people are fixed on the launch pad. The ignition sequence is about to start. The roar of the monster rocket ready to shake the world. We stand at the precipice, holding our breath as the fire prepares to take us back. Are we finally ready to stay?